My mom threatened, if you sue me, you'll never be welcome in this family again. I looked her in the eye and replied, when was I ever welcome? Then I took her to court and won back every dollar she stole. I'm 32, and I grew up in a house where the thermostat was set to emotionally unavailable year-round. I'm talking about a family that could witness you saving a bus full of orphans from a burning building and respond with, well, the fire department would have gotten there eventually. That was my childhood. That was my 20s. And honestly, that was my whole life until about 4 months ago, when everything blew up in the most poetic way possible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the middle kid of 3. My older brother Connor is 35, and my younger sister Paige is 28. Our mom Diane raised us mostly on her own after our dad Ray took off when I was 11. Now when I say took off, I don't mean he went to get milk and never came back. He moved 45 minutes away to Maryville with a woman named Sheila he'd been seeing behind my mom's back, started a whole new little chapter of his life, and just sort of stopped being interested in the chapters he'd already written. He'd show up for Christmas, sometimes call on birthdays if he remembered, and send checks that bounced more often than they cleared. Real father of the year material. So it was mostly mom holding it down, and I'll give her credit for keeping the lights on. She worked at a dental office as the front desk person for almost 20 years. But here's the thing about my mom that took me way too long to understand. She had this invisible ranking system for her kids, and I was always slotted right at the bottom. Connor was the golden child. Firstborn football star at his high school, loud personality, looked exactly like our dad, which you'd think would work against him, but somehow made my mom adore him more. Like, she was trying to love the version of Ray that didn't leave. And Paige was the baby, the little princess, who could do no wrong because she was the youngest, and also because she learned early how to cry on command to get what she wanted. That kid could have set the house on fire, and my mom would have blamed the matches. Then there was me, Aaron, the middle one, the quiet one, the one who got decent grades and didn't cause problems. And somehow that was the worst thing I could have done, because I wasn't loud enough to demand attention, and I wasn't cute enough to get it automatically. So I just kind of existed in the background of my own family, like furniture. You know how some houses have that one chair nobody ever sits in? That was me. Decorative at best, invisible at worst. I don't want you to think I'm throwing a pity party here. I'm just giving you the foundation so the rest of this makes sense. Because the thing about being ignored your whole life is that you either crumble under it or you build yourself into someone who doesn't need the applause. I chose the second option, though it took me a while. I worked my way through the University of Tennessee. No scholarships, no family help. I took out loans, worked part-time at a hardware store, and graduated with a degree in business management. Walked across that stage in my cap and gown, looked out into the audience, and saw my mom sitting there scrolling through her phone. Connor didn't come because he had a softball tournament. Paige didn't come because she said she couldn't find a ride even though she lived 12 minutes from campus. My mom hugged me afterward and said, "Good, now you can get a real job." That was it. No, I'm proud of you. No, you did it. Just a pivot to what I should be doing next. And look, I know some of you might think I'm being sensitive. Maybe I am. But when I tell you that Connor got a surprise party when he finished a 6-week welding certification, complete with a cake that said, "Our Star," you'll maybe understand why a little acknowledgement at my college graduation would have been nice. Just a little. Even a "hey, good job, kid" would have gone a long way. After college, I moved to Nashville, got an entry-level job at a logistics company called Ridgeline Freight, and started grinding. I'm talking 60-hour weeks, learning everything I could about supply chain operations, volunteering for projects nobody else wanted, basically making myself indispensable. Within 3 years, I got promoted to operations manager. Called my mom to tell her. She said, "That's nice, honey. Hey, did Connor tell you he's thinking about opening a barbecue food truck?" She then spent 20 minutes talking about Connor's food truck idea, which, by the way, never happened, because Connor's longest commitment to anything is about 6 weeks. The man has started and abandoned more projects than I can count. But every single one of those abandoned projects got more enthusiasm from my mother than anything I actually accomplished. I started dating a woman named Jenna about 4 years ago. Met her at a friend's birthday party at one of those axe-throwing places in East Nashville. She was terrible at it, which she found hilarious instead of embarrassing, and I knew right then she was different. Jenna's the kind of person who sees right through pretense. Second date, she asked me straight up why I never talked about my family. I gave her the sanitized version. By the 6th date, I gave her the real one. She looked at me and said, "Aaron, that's not normal. You know that, right?" And honestly, hearing someone say that out loud was like having a doctor finally diagnose something you've been feeling your whole life. Jenna became my anchor. She had her own tight-knit family up in Clarksville, parents who called her just to say they were thinking about her, a brother who texted her funny memes every morning. Being around them showed me what I'd been missing, but it also showed me what was possible. I didn't have to keep going back to a well that was bone dry just because it had my last name on it. About 2 years ago, things between me and my mom went completely silent. Not because of a big blowout fight, Not of some dramatic last straw. It just sort of faded. I stopped calling because I got tired of feeling like I was interrupting her day. She stopped calling because, well, she never really started. Connor would still pop up in my life occasionally, usually when he needed something. Paige and I hadn't had a real conversation in over a year. I was essentially an orphan with living parents, which is a special kind of lonely that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But here's where it gets interesting, because while my family was busy pretending I didn't exist, I was quietly building a life that would eventually make all of them very, very interested in my existence again. And the catalyst for all of it was a $400,000 house on a half-acre in Franklin, Tennessee that I closed on exactly 8 weeks ago. The day I got the keys, I didn't call anyone in my family. Jenna and I stood on the front porch. She took a photo of me holding the keys, and I posted it on social media because I was proud of myself even if nobody else was going to be. I captioned it something simple: first house, earned every square foot, and I put my phone away and didn't think about it again. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was a number I almost didn't recognize because it had been so long since I'd seen it. Mom Diane calling me for the first time in almost 2 years. My stomach did this thing where it dropped and flipped at the same time like a gymnast falling off a balance beam. I stared at the phone for 2 rings, looked at Jenna, and she just raised her eyebrows like, well, this should be good. I answered, and the first words out of my mother's mouth were not congratulations. They were not, I'm proud of you. They were not, I'm sorry I haven't called. The first thing she said was, Aaron, I need to talk to you about something important. It's about Connor. Of course it was. I stood there in my brand new kitchen, leaning against the counter that still had the protective film on it, and listened to my mother explain why she was calling. Not to acknowledge the biggest purchase of my life, not to reconnect after 2 years of silence, but to talk about Connor. Turns out my golden brother had gotten himself into a mess. Connor had taken out a lease on a commercial space in downtown Knoxville to finally, seriously for real this time, open his barbecue restaurant. He'd signed a 3-year lease, dumped about $40,000 into renovations and equipment, most of it borrowed from credit cards and a predatory lender with an interest rate that should be illegal. The restaurant opened for about 11 weeks before Connor realized that running a business required things like showing up every day and not giving free meals to everybody who walked through the door. Shocking, I know. Now Connor was roughly $65,000 in debt. The restaurant was closed. The landlord was threatening to sue. And my brother was living back at mom's house at 35, sleeping in his old bedroom with his high school football trophies still on the shelf. And the reason my mom was calling me the son she hadn't spoken to in 2 years was to ask me to bail him out. He just needs a little help getting back on his feet, she said, using the same tone she'd used my entire life whenever Connor needed something, like she was narrating a nature documentary about an endangered species. You've always been the responsible one, Aaron. You're good with money. I figured with the new house and everything, you must be doing well. I let that sentence hang in the air for a moment. Let it marinate. She figured with the new house, I must be doing well. She saw my achievement not as something to celebrate, but as evidence that I had resources to funnel toward Connor. My success was only relevant because it could service his failure. I wish I could tell you I was surprised, but that would be a lie. What I was honestly was tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that lives in your chest and makes everything feel heavier than it should. Mom, I said you haven't called me in 2 years. There was a pause. Then she said, well, you didn't call me either. And there it was, the classic deflection, the patented Diane redirect. Take any valid point and bounce it right back, so she never has to sit with the discomfort of being wrong. I'd seen her do it 1,000 times. When I was 16 and asked why Connor got a car for his birthday, but I got a gift card to Target, she said, well, you never said you wanted a car. As if a 16-year-old needs to formally submit a request to be treated equally. I'm not giving Connor money, I said. Calm, clear, no anger, just a boundary. That's when the temperature of the conversation changed. My mother went from syrupy and sweet to cold in about 2 seconds flat. I'm not asking you to give him money. I'm asking you to help your family. That's what families do, Aaron. But you've always had a problem with that, haven't you? You've always been off in your own little world, too good for the rest of us. Too good for the rest of them. I almost laughed. I spent 20 years begging for a crumb of recognition from this woman, and now I was too good for them. The narrative had flipped so smoothly you'd think she'd rehearsed it. In her version of history, I wasn't the kid who got ignored. I was the kid who pulled away. Masterclass in rewriting the past. I told her I had to go. She said, fine, but think about it. He's your brother. And she hung up without saying goodbye. I put my phone on the counter and just stood there. Jenna came in from the other room, took one look at my face and said, what did she want? I told her everything. And Jenna, bless her, didn't explode or rant. She just shook her head slowly and said, Aaron, you owe these people absolutely nothing. I knew she was right, but knowing something and feeling it are two very different things. Over the next couple of weeks, the situation escalated. Connor started texting me directly. At first, it was casual. Hey man, long time. Heard you bought a house. That's awesome. Then it shifted. Mom said she talked to you. I'm in a really bad spot, bro. Any chance you could help me out? Even just 10 grand would buy me some time. 10 grand like I just had that sitting in a sock drawer. I didn't respond. Not because I'm heartless, but because I knew that any engagement would be interpreted as an opening. With my family, A maybe becomes a yes, and a let me think about it becomes a he said he'd do it. So I stayed quiet. And that's when Paige got involved. My little sister, who I hadn't heard from in over a year, suddenly found my number. She called me on a Wednesday evening. "Aaron, what is wrong with you?" she started. "No hello, just straight to the attack. Mom is stressed out of her mind and you're just sitting in your fancy new house ignoring everyone. She cried yesterday. She actually cried because her own son won't help his brother." I took a breath. Paige, did Mom cry when I graduated college? Silence. Did she cry when I got promoted? Did she cry during the 2 years she didn't call me? Did anyone in this family shed a single tear about me at any point ever? More silence. Then Paige said, "That's not the same thing and you know it." "You're right," I said. "It's not the same because those were good things that happened to me and nobody cared. This is a bad thing that happened to Connor, and suddenly the whole family has my number memorized." She called me selfish. She said I was punishing Connor for Mom's mistakes, that I was being petty and small, that I'd regret this when Mom was gone someday. Every guilt trip in the playbook rapid fire like she'd been coached. And honestly, she probably had been. I hung up on Paige. First time in my life I'd ever hung up on anyone. And then I sat down at my kitchen table and cried. Not because I was sad exactly, but because I was grieving something I never actually had. The fantasy of a family that gave a damn about me. I'd been carrying this stupid, stubborn hope that someday they'd see me. And in that moment, sitting in the house I'd earned with no help from anyone, I finally let that hope go. Jenna sat next to me and didn't say a word. She just put her hand on my back and let me have it. That's the thing about Jenna. She never tries to fix what doesn't need fixing. She just stays. After that night, things went quiet for about a week. I went back to work, focused on a big contract Ridgeline was trying to land with a distribution center in Memphis, and tried to put the whole mess out of my mind. Then the Facebook post happened. My mother, Diane, wrote a Facebook post that I can only describe as a performance. Long, dramatic, designed for maximum sympathy. She wrote about how hard it is being a single mother, how she sacrificed everything for her children, how some people forget where they came from when they get a little success. She didn't name me directly, but she didn't have to. She wrote about how one of her children had turned his back on the family during their darkest hour, how money changes people, how she prays every night that he'll come back to who he really is. The comments were brutal. Aunts, cousins, family, friends, all piling on about how shameful it was that some people abandon their families. My cousin Derek commented, "Family is everything. Anyone who walks away from that is trash." My Aunt Linda wrote, "Diane, you deserve better. You gave those kids everything. Everything." That word bounced around in my skull. Connor got a car. I got a gift card. Connor got a party. I got a phone call. Connor got tears and emergency family meetings. I got 2 years of silence. That was everything, apparently. Jenna saw the post before I did. She showed me with her jaw clenched and her eyes sharp. "This is unhinged," she said. "Aaron, this woman just publicly humiliated you to cover for your brother's mess." She was right. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't hurt. I wasn't sad. I was done. Something clicked off inside me like a switch, and what replaced it was clarity. Cold, clean, absolute clarity about who these people were and who I refused to be for them anymore. I didn't comment on the post. I didn't call my mom. I didn't text Connor or Paige. Instead, I did something that would change the trajectory of this whole situation, though I didn't know it yet. I called my dad. I know what you're thinking. Your deadbeat dad. The guy who bailed when you were 11. Why on earth would you call him? And honestly, fair question. But here's the thing about complicated families. Sometimes the person who hurt you the least isn't the person who was there the most. It's the person who at least had the decency to be honestly absent instead of dishonestly present. My dad, Ray, wasn't a good father. I want to be clear about that. He left, he checked out, he prioritized his new life over his old one. But in the last few years, something had shifted. He'd reached out a couple of times. Nothing pushy, just short texts on my birthday or a comment on a social media post. He congratulated me when I posted about the house. Actually wrote, "Proud of you, son," in the comments. 2 years of silence from my mother and 3 words from my estranged father hit harder than anything she'd ever said or hadn't said. So I called him. It was awkward at first. Lots of long pauses and throat clearing, and the kind of careful conversation two people have when they know there's a minefield between them, but they're trying to walk through it anyway. I told him what was going on. The phone call from Mom, Connor's debt, Paige's guilt trip, the Facebook post. All of it. Ray was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Aaron, I owe you an apology. Not for what your mom did. That's on her. But for not being there so you had someone in your corner. I was selfish and you paid for it. I can't fix that, but I can tell you that you're doing the right thing. Don't let them bleed you dry because they finally noticed you exist." It wasn't a Hallmark movie moment. He didn't suddenly become Father of the Year, but it was honest, and after a lifetime of being gaslit by my mother, honesty felt like oxygen. We talked for almost an hour. He told me about his life now, how Sheila had left him a few years back, how he'd been going to therapy and working on himself. He told me he'd been wanting to reach out more, but didn't know if I'd want to hear from him. I told him I didn't know either, but I was glad he answered the phone. That conversation didn't fix everything between us, but it opened a door I didn't know I needed opened. And more importantly, it gave me perspective. My father, the man who walked away, had more self-awareness than my mother, the woman who stayed. He could say I was wrong without the world ending. My mom couldn't even say, "I'm proud of you," without it costing her something she wasn't willing to spend. After that call, something shifted in me. I stopped grieving the family I wished I had and started investing in the life I was actually building. Jenna and I threw ourselves into the new house. We painted every room ourselves, spent weekends at estate sales finding furniture built raised garden beds in the backyard. My buddy from work, Travis, helped me build a deck off the back of the house over 2 weekends. We ate pizza on it the night we finished, feet up on the railing watching the sunset over the tree line, and I remember thinking, this is what peace feels like. Work was going well too. That Memphis contract I mentioned, I landed it. Biggest deal, Ridgeline Freight, had closed in 2 years, and I was the one who made it happen. My boss, a guy named Grant, who'd been in logistics for 30 years and smiled about as often as a DMV employee, actually shook my hand and said, "Hell of a job, Aaron." That handshake meant more to me than any birthday cake my mom never made. The promotion came about 3 weeks later. Senior Operations Director, corner office company car salary, that made me sit in the parking lot and stare at the offer letter for 10 minutes because I genuinely couldn't believe it. I'd gone from the kid nobody noticed to the guy running a department of 40 people, and I did it without a dime or a word of encouragement from the people who were supposed to be my biggest supporters. Jenna and I celebrated at a nice restaurant in downtown Nashville. She raised her glass and said, "To the man who built himself from scratch." I almost lost it right there over my steak because that's exactly what it felt like. Like I'd built myself from raw materials with no blueprint and no help. Just stubbornness and spite, and a refusal to prove my mother right. During this time, I also started seeing a therapist named Dr. Leo Whitfield. Jenna had been gently suggesting it for a while, and I finally caved. Best decision I ever made after buying the house and choosing Jenna. Dr. Whitfield helped me understand patterns I'd been living in my whole life. The people-pleasing, the constant need to prove myself, the way I'd internalize every slight and carry it like a backpack full of rocks. She helped me put the rocks down. Not all at once, but one by one. One session she asked me, "Aaron, if your mother called tomorrow and said she was proud of you, how would you feel?" And I sat there and really thought about it. A year ago, I would have said relieved, happy, whole. But sitting in that chair in my new life with my new job and my new house and the woman I loved waiting for me at home, I said I think I'd feel suspicious. And Dr. Whitfield smiled like I'd just solved an equation she'd been waiting for me to crack. That was the moment I realized I didn't need them anymore. Not their approval, not their attention, not their pride. I'd spent 32 years auditioning for a role in a family that had already cast someone else, and I was done reading for the part. Meanwhile, I got bits and pieces of what was happening back in Knoxville through the family grapevine, mostly from my cousin Greg, who was one of the few relatives who hadn't piled on during the Facebook fiasco. Greg was a decent guy, kind of the neutral party in our extended family, and he'd text me updates every now and then like a war correspondent reporting from the front lines. Connor's financial situation was getting worse. The landlord had followed through on the lawsuit. Connor had no lawyer because he couldn't afford one and was trying to represent himself, which from what Greg described was going about as well as you'd expect. My mom had apparently drained a chunk of her savings trying to help him, which meant she was now struggling too. Paige had conveniently disappeared from the rescue mission once it became clear that helping Connor required actual money and not just phone calls yelling at me. Part of me felt a pang of something, guilt maybe, or maybe just the echo of the kid I used to be. The one who wanted so badly to be useful to his family that he would have set himself on fire to keep them warm. But Dr. Whitfield had taught me to recognize that impulse for what it was. It wasn't love, it wasn't duty, it was a trauma response. I'd been conditioned to believe that my value was tied to what I could provide, and every time I felt that pull, I was just falling back into an old pattern that had never served me. So I let it go. I focused on my life. Jenna and I adopted a dog, a ridiculous-looking mutt named Biscuit who was mostly ears and enthusiasm. I reconnected with Ray slowly, carefully, building something that resembled a relationship for the first time since I was a kid. I got closer with Jenna's family. Her parents unofficially adopted me, and her mom Carol started calling me every Sunday just to check in. First time in my life, someone's mother called me just because they wanted to talk to me. Life was good, really, genuinely good. And I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop because I'd learned that sometimes there is no other shoe. Sometimes you just get to be happy. But then Greg called me on a Thursday evening with news that changed everything. "Hey man," he said, his voice carrying that specific tone people use when they're about to tell you something big. "Did you know your grandmother left a will?" My grandmother, my mom's mother, Eleanor, had passed away about 8 months earlier. I'd gone to the funeral, sat in the back, left before the reception. I figured whatever she had went to my mom and my Aunt Linda, which was fine. I hadn't been close with Eleanor. She was very much in the Diane is a saint camp, and I had no expectations. Yeah, I said, so what? So Greg said, apparently she left more than anyone thought. And apparently, there's a provision in there that involves you specifically. Your mom's been real quiet about it, which is how you know something's up. I felt a chill go down my spine. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you realize a puzzle you didn't know you were solving just revealed a new piece. The next morning, I called Greg back and got the full download. Here's what he'd pieced together from overhearing conversations at a family gathering I obviously wasn't invited to. My grandmother Eleanor had been sharper than anyone gave her credit for. She'd been a school teacher for 40 years, lived modestly, drove the same car for a decade, and apparently saved and invested with the quiet discipline of someone who understood that wealth isn't about what you earn, it's about what you keep. When she passed, the estate was worth just north of $600,000. A house in West Knoxville, a brokerage account, some savings, and a life insurance policy. Her will, which had been updated about 2 years before she died, laid things out very specifically. The house went to Aunt Linda. A portion of the savings went to my mom. But the brokerage account, which was worth roughly $170,000, was split into 3 equal shares designated for her grandchildren. Not her children, her grandchildren, Connor, me, and Paige, about $56,000 each. Now here's where it gets interesting. The will had a condition. The disbursements to the grandchildren were to be handled by the executor, which was my mom. Diane was supposed to distribute the funds within 6 months of Eleanor's death. It had been 8 months. Connor and Paige had received their shares. I hadn't received a dime. I hadn't even been told it existed. Let that sink in for a second. My own mother, the executor of my grandmother's estate, had given my brother and sister their inheritance and simply pretended mine didn't exist. She pocketed my $56,000. And the timing was almost too perfect to be coincidental because this all happened right around the time Connor's restaurant was hemorrhaging money and my mom was trying to get me to bail him out. Greg didn't have all the legal details, but he'd seen enough family drama to connect the dots. I think your mom used your share to help Connor, he said. Or at least part of it, and I think that's why she was so aggressive about getting you to send money. Because if you just voluntarily helped, nobody would have ever looked too closely at the estate. I sat at my kitchen table and felt something I can only describe as cold fire. Not rage, not exactly, more like every suspicion I'd ever had about my place in this family crystallizing into a single undeniable truth. They didn't just ignore me, they actively took from me. They saw my silence as permission and my absence as opportunity. I told Jenna everything. She went pale, then red, then she started pacing the kitchen like a prosecutor preparing closing arguments. Aaron, this isn't just family drama. This is theft. This is a legal matter. You need a lawyer. She was right, and I knew exactly who to call. Jenna's brother Kyle worked at a law firm in Clarksville. He wasn't an estate attorney himself, but he knew one. Within 2 days, I was sitting in the office of a woman named Rebecca Caldwell, an estate and probate lawyer who had the common intensity of someone who'd seen every version of family betrayal there was and still found each new case personally offensive. I laid out everything. The will, the missing inheritance, the timeline, the Facebook post, all of it. I showed her Greg's texts, my mom's messages, Connor's request for money, everything. Rebecca listened without interrupting, took notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I was done, she looked up and said, "Your mother has a fiduciary duty as executor. If she dispersed funds to your siblings and withheld yours, that's a breach. If she used your share for another purpose, that's conversion. We have options. Options." I like the sound of that word. For the first time in this whole mess, I wasn't reacting. I was acting. Rebecca filed a formal demand letter to my mother within the week. It was beautiful in the way that legal documents can be beautiful, precise, cold, and impossible to misinterpret. It stated that I was aware of my grandmother's will, aware of the brokerage account, disbursement, aware that my share had not been distributed, and that I was requesting full payment within 30 days, or I would pursue legal action, including a petition to have my mother removed as executor and a civil claim for breach of fiduciary duty. The letter went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, my phone was ringing off the hook. Connor called first. "Dude, what are you doing? You're going to sue Mom. Are you serious right now?" I didn't answer. Let it go to voicemail. He left 3. Paige texted a novel. The highlights included, "You're tearing this family apart. Grandma would be ashamed of you." And my personal favorite, "This is why nobody ever calls you." As if the reason nobody called me was because I had the audacity to want what was legally mine. Then Mom called. I let it ring twice and picked up because I wanted to hear this. "Aaron Michael, what is this letter?" Her voice was shaking. Not with sadness, with anger. She was furious. Furious that I'd found out. Furious that I'd lawyered up. Furious that her quiet little middle child had finally stopped being quiet. "It's a demand letter, Mom. From my attorney. You know what's in it? This is ridiculous. Your grandmother wanted that money to go to the family, and it went to the family. Connor needed help. He was in trouble. I used the money where it was needed most. There it was. The confession delivered casually, like she was explaining why she'd moved the leftover casserole from one shelf of the fridge to another. She used my inheritance to bail out Connor. She took money that my grandmother specifically designated for me and gave it to her favorite child. And she didn't even see the problem. Mom, that money was mine. Grandma's will said it was mine. You were legally required to give it to me. Don't you lecture me about legality. I am your mother, and I am your son. Though I realize that means different things depending on which son you're talking about. She went quiet. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, if you do this, Aaron, if you actually take me to court, you will never be welcome in this family again. I let that threat hang in the air for a moment. Let it settle. And then I said something that I'd been carrying around for 20 years. Mom, when was I ever welcome? She hung up. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It did. Even when you know the truth. Even when you've processed it in therapy and talked it through with your partner and accepted it intellectually, hearing your mother confirm that your place in the family is conditional still lands like a punch you saw coming but couldn't dodge. Jenna held me that night. Biscuit wedged himself between us on the couch like a furry therapist. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to back down. Not because I needed the money though, $56,000 isn't nothing, but because my grandmother put my name in that will for a reason. She saw me. Maybe she was the only one in that family who ever did, and I wasn't going to let my mother erase that too. Rebecca and I met again the following week to prepare the next steps. She'd done some digging. Turns out the brokerage account had records of exactly when the disbursements were made. Connor's share was withdrawn 4 months after Eleanor died. Paige's was withdrawn 5 months after. Mine was withdrawn 5.5 months after, right before the 6-month deadline, and deposited into my mother's personal checking account. From there, Rebecca found records of a cashier's check made out to the landlord who was suing Connor. My money laundered through my mother's account, sent directly to cover my brother's failed business. Rebecca looked at me over her glasses and said, Aaron, this isn't ambiguous. This is textbook conversion and breach of fiduciary duty. If this goes to court, you'll win. The question is whether you want to settle or make a statement. I thought about the gift card on my 16th birthday. I thought about my mom scrolling her phone at my graduation. I thought about 2 years of silence and a phone call that started with Connor's name. I thought about a Facebook post designed to make me the villain. And I looked at Rebecca and said, I want to make a statement. The petition was filed on a Friday. Rebecca submitted it to the probate court in Knox County, requesting a full accounting of Eleanor's estate, removal of Diana's executor, and restitution of my share plus legal fees. She also filed a separate civil claim for conversion. 2 legal proceedings, both airtight, both supported by paper trails that my mother apparently never thought anyone would bother to follow. The court date was set for 6 weeks out, and in those 6 weeks, the circus truly came to town. First, Aunt Linda called me. I hadn't spoken to her in years, and she opened with, Aaron, I don't know what kind of games you're playing, but you need to drop this nonsense before you embarrass the whole family. I told her calmly that my mother stole my inheritance and gave it to Connor. Linda stammered and said she was helping your brother. That's what a mother does. I said she was helping my brother with my money. That's what a thief does. Linda hung up on me. I was getting pretty used to that sound by now. Then Connor showed up at my house in Franklin. He drove 3 hours to knock on my door at 7:00 in the evening on a Saturday, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were red, his clothes were wrinkled, and he smelled vaguely like the inside of a bar. Jenna answered the door and immediately said, Aaron, your brother is here, in a tone that suggested she was reporting a pest sighting. I came to the door, and there he was, my big brother, the golden child, looking decidedly ungolden. Can we talk? He said. I stepped out onto the porch. Jenna stayed inside, but I could feel her watching through the window like a hawk monitoring a field mouse. Aaron, man, I'm sorry. I know this whole thing is messed up, but you got to understand, I was drowning. Mom said she had money set aside for emergencies, and she offered to help. I didn't know it was from Grandma's will. I didn't know it was your share. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I wanted to believe that. I genuinely did. But then I thought about the text he'd sent me asking for $10,000. If you didn't know, my mom had already taken my inheritance. Why was he also coming to me for money? The math didn't add up. He knew, maybe not the legal details, but he knew that money was coming from somewhere that wasn't rightfully his. Connor. I said, did you ever once in your entire life think about me? Not as someone who could help you. Not as someone who might have money. Just as your brother. Did you ever think about what it was like being me in our family? He blinked, opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, I mean, we're brothers, man. I always cared about you. When I said, give me one example. One time you showed up for me. One time you called just to see how I was doing. One birthday you remembered. One accomplishment you acknowledged. One single moment where I was the person in this family who mattered. He stared at the ground. The silence between us stretched out like a highway. He didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. He couldn't name a single time because there hadn't been one, and we both knew it. That's what I thought I said. I'm not dropping the case, Connor, and I think you should leave. He left, didn't say another word, just got in his truck and drove away. I watched his taillights disappear down the road, and I felt nothing. Not anger, Not satisfaction, not sadness, just the quiet emptiness of a chapter finally closing. The court date arrived on a cool Thursday morning. Rebecca and I drove to Knoxville together. Went over the case one final time in the parking lot. She was confident. I was nervous but steady. We walked in, and there was my mother sitting at the respondent's table with a lawyer I assumed she'd scraped together at the last minute. Connor was in the gallery. Paige was not, because of course she wasn't. Aunt Linda was there too, arms crossed, radiating disapproval from the second row like a space heater of judgment. Rebecca presented the case methodically. The will, the brokerage statements, the disbursement records, the bank transfers, the cashier's check to Connor's landlord. Every piece of evidence laid out like a hand of cards that couldn't be beaten. My mother's lawyer argued that Diane had acted in good faith and intended to reimburse my share once things stabilized. Rebecca pointed out that my mother had never communicated this plan to me, had never disclosed the inheritance at all, and had in fact tried to extract additional money from me during the same period. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Sykes, who looked like she'd been adjudicating family nonsense for decades and was deeply tired of it, asked my mother directly, "Mrs. Dawson, did you distribute the decedent's brokerage funds to your daughter and your elder son while withholding the share designated for your younger son?" My mother hesitated. Her lawyer whispered something, and then she said, "I used the money where it was needed." Connor was in crisis. Judge Sykes looked at her for a long moment and said, "That was not the question I asked. The question was whether you withheld funds that were legally designated for your son Aaron. Yes or no?" "Yes," my mother said quietly, like the word was being pulled out of her against her will. The judge ruled in my favor. Full restitution of my share, $56,000 plus legal fees totaling just over $8,000. My mother was removed as executor, and the court appointed a neutral third party to handle any remaining estate matters. Judge Sykes also noted on the record that Diane's conduct constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty and that her actions warranted the additional civil penalties outlined in the conversion claim. When the ruling was read, my mother didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead like a statue. Connor dropped his head into his hands. Aunt Linda stormed out of the courtroom muttering something I couldn't quite hear, but I'm sure it was deeply complimentary. I walked out of that courthouse into the November air and took the deepest breath I'd taken in 32 years. Rebecca shook my hand and said, "You did the right thing," and I believed her. The aftermath played out over the following weeks. My mother had to liquidate some of her savings to pay the judgment. I hear she's furious. I hear she tells anyone who'll listen that I betrayed her, that I chose money over family, that I'm the ungrateful son who sued his own mother. And you know what? Let her. Let her tell that story to whoever she wants, because the people who matter know the truth. And the people who believe her version are people whose opinions I stopped valuing a long time ago. Connor's still in debt, still living at mom's house, still starting projects he'll never finish. Greg told me Connor applied for a job at a warehouse and lasted 2 weeks before quitting because the hours were too rigid. Some things never change. Paige reached out once about a month after the court date. She sent a text that said, "I hope you're happy." I wrote back, "I am actually. Thanks for asking." She didn't respond. My dad and I talk every couple of weeks now. It's not perfect. There are still awkward silences and decades of damage that can't be undone with phone calls. But he's trying, and that's more than anyone else in my bloodline ever offered. He came down to Franklin for Thanksgiving. Jenna made a turkey that was honestly a little overcooked, but nobody cared because the table was full of people who actually wanted to be there. Ray Jenna's parents, Carol and Dan, her brother Kyle and his wife Travis from work, and Biscuit, who sat under the table waiting for scraps with the patience of a saint. I stood in my kitchen that night after everyone left loading the dishwasher, and I thought about that Facebook post my mom wrote, the one about how money changes people. She was right about one thing. Money did change something. Not me. It changed my visibility. For 32 years, I was invisible to my family. The second I had something they wanted, I suddenly existed. But the joke's on them because by the time they finally looked in my direction, I'd already built a whole life in the space where their attention should have been. And that life, it's pretty great. I've got a house that's almost finished exactly the way I want it. I've got a job that challenges me and a boss who respects me. I've who loses his mind with happiness every time I walk through the door. I've got a woman who loves me not for what I can provide, but for who I am. And I've got a future that belongs entirely to me, unshared, unborrowed, and unowned to anyone who only noticed me when it was convenient. My mom never did say she was proud of me, and I finally stopped needing her to.